Hi there, good afternoon. My name is Carolyn Rennie. I'm the Executive Director for the Salmon Arm Chamber of Commerce, and I'd like to welcome you all to our keynote luncheon, which is our 2021 budget overview featuring Shuswap MLA Greg Kyllo. I would like to start off by acknowledging that we are on the traditional and unceded territory of the Shuswap First Nation peoples. I would ask that everyone keep their microphones on mute until we get to the question and answer period. And I don't have much of an introduction today, so I'm going to flip it right to you, Greg. So I'll get you to share your screen and we'll get started.
Great. Well, thank you very much. So maybe just before we kind of jump into the presentation, I wanted to thank everybody for taking the time today to have a bit of an update on the most current provincial budget. And maybe it's a bit of an opener. I'll just, for those of you that may have not met me previously, just provide just a little bit of background. So Greg Kyllo, of course, I live in Sicamous. Sicamous has been my home since 1978, so been there just about long enough, I think, to be considered a local now. I was born in northern BC, up in Fort St. John, and our family moved down to Sicamous area in 1978. I married my high school sweetheart. Geez, it must be 34 years ago now. And we've got 4 daughters. They're all grown now and all living in the Shuswap. 3 of my daughters are in Sicamous and 1's in Canoe. And they blessed us with 9 grandkids just in the last 7 years. I was first elected back in 2013, re-elected in 2017, and then again just most recently in the October election of last year. So just in my 3rd term. Have a fairly significant amount of business experience, Twin Anchors Houseboat Vacations and Twin Anchors Marine Manufacturing in Sicamous, kind of our family's business. Got involved with the companies back in 1987, just freshly out of college, and obviously seen some pretty significant growth over the years. It was back in 2012 when then Premier Christy Clark and I met for the first time. And George Abbott, who was a previous MLA, when he announced his retirement in August of 2012, Christy had actually reached out and encouraged my wife Georgina and I that this was the right thing for us and it was the right time. And although we were a little bit hesitant at first, had a lot of support of my partner and my brother Todd Kyllo in order to step aside from the business, which was initially going to be what I thought was just for a 4-year term. Now is getting into 8 years long, with another 4 years to go in this current term. So, you know, have a bit of business background, obviously both in manufacturing and the tourism sector, and so the presentation that we'll be going through today largely will focus on not so much the social services sector and that side of the provincial budget, but the areas of the provincial budget that have the most significant impact on businesses here in the Shuswap. Obviously, goes without saying the challenges that our province, our country, and around the globe that we've had over the last 15 months now on account of COVID. And I'm really happy to see that that government has finally come forward with a bit of a strategic plan as far as how we're going to look at opening the economy back up. Many businesses have really struggled over the last 15 months, and it's great to finally be in a position where we see a little bit of hope and opportunity on the horizon. So I think with that, I'll just kind of move into the, start sharing my screen. Hopefully everybody can see it. Is that up now, Carolyn?
Yeah, it looks great.
Okay, super. And I should also mention, since we had the last election, I was actually appointed as the critic for labor. There's a pretty hefty labor agenda that the current government has that they're looking forward to undertaking in the next 4 years. And there was also 2 very important pieces of labor legislation that have been tabled in the legislature just in the last month. So as we go through in the slide deck, I'll be able to try to share a little bit of information on the legislation, Bill 3 and Bill 13, and the potential implications that will have both currently and going into the future on the business community. So COVID impacts, goes without saying the significant impact it has had on all sectors of the economy. As we've noted, women and youth have been most highly impacted with increases in unemployment through COVID. Definitely had a significant impact on restaurants and the tourism sector. We have been fortunate here in Shuswap in that we rely more largely on regional tourism. And so although COVID certainly had a significant impact last spring and over the course of the winter, most businesses in the Shuswap had indicated they had a fairly reasonable revenue stream over the last summer, and bookings are looking strong for this year for the most part, which is a very different story to what we see in the Lower Mainland and Southern Vancouver Island that rely more significantly on international travel. So sectors in Vancouver and Southern Vancouver Island have really been absolutely decimated with the impacts on the cruise industry and just the lack of international travelers actually able to come and visit our beautiful province. So although there has been challenges here locally, I would say that we have not had the same level or degree of negative implication as they have in some of the larger areas of the province. Job recovery, significant job losses, obviously through COVID. Job numbers have come back, but there's been a real shift. We've lost a significant number of private sector jobs that have yet to actually return, where most of the increase has been over the last number of years has actually been the growth of the public service. So as you see there on the slide screen, and this slide is actually a little bit out of date. This was from about a month ago. We're now understanding that the public sector has grown by about 80,000 additional jobs in the last year. And a lot of that is understandable, you know, increases in healthcare. But moreover, what we have to have a look at and be cognizant of is a significant fiscal impact that any increases in the job numbers in the public sector will have on the provincial budget. The mean average wage, loaded wage for a public servant now is approaching about $80,000. So just doing quick math, even on 60,000 additional new public sector jobs, that's about $4.8 billion. So $4,800 million a year of additional cost associated with the growth of the public sector. And that will go on year over year. And I think if we take that into context, the province runs on about a $70 billion annual budget. So almost a 10% increase in the size of or the impact on the provincial budget just in the last year, largely through the growth of the public sector. And it's worth noting that you know, public sector provide very important services, whether we're talking about you know, teachers that educate our children or our nurses and other areas of government, you know, very important, but those jobs do consume tax dollars. It's largely the private sector that provides the bulk of the revenues for government, which provides obviously government then the ability to provide all the necessary services that we all rely on. So I think it's important to note that as you know, if you look at the news coverage and you hear government talking about the return of jobs, and the last number I heard expressed by the jobs minister, Ravi Kahlon, was that about 98.5% of pre-pandemic jobs have actually have returned. It's important to note that the large majority of those additional jobs are in the public service, not in the private sector. So the private sector is still really trailing far behind as far as getting back to pre-COVID levels. And as we know, the tourism industry has been the hardest hit sector of the economy. So small businesses, I will say that you know, the federal government, I think, was very quick and also appeared to be very nimble in adjusting some of their supports for businesses through CEWS and the CERB payments. And those have really provided a significant amount of support for businesses across the province as they've struggled to try and keep their doors open on account of COVID. When it comes to the provincial side, despite a $5 billion COVID spending plan being approved unanimously last March, so a year ago this last March, in the legislature, government was fairly slow to actually get any direct supports out to business. There's a study that government are relying on that was undertaken about 8 months ago that combined both business supports and supports for individuals. And you may hear government touting that we have some of the highest supports for businesses and individuals in the country. That statement is very misleading, and it's misleading in this way, in that if you just look at direct supports of the provincial government to businesses, we're actually number 8 in Canada. The study that government are relying on includes those supports not just to businesses, but also to individuals. And it also takes into consideration all of the different funding streams that come from the federal government as well. But if you look at the actual direct supports, direct funding support provided by the provincial government to help our business community, we're actually number 8 in Canada. And the province of BC is providing only a third of the direct funding support to small business as compared to the province of Ontario, as an example. So I think there's certainly much more that government could do if we compare the supports of the provincial government here in BC to other provinces in Canada. And also the delay. There were some significant challenges with getting money out the door. Businesses last year that were really struggling and having a tough time. I think it goes without saying that that the direct supports from the province were very slow to actually respond and provide any funds to help those businesses that were really challenged with increased costs and decreased revenues over the last year. The COVID restart funding program, the recovery grant, was actually not announced until just ahead of the announcement of the provincial election last fall. And so the timing is a little bit concerning. Obviously, I'm a BC Liberal MLA. I'm part of the official opposition, and being a part of the official opposition is largely to oppose, and my critic portfolio largely is to criticize, to provide the counter narrative to the messaging that government may be putting out. And so, as we looked at entering the COVID crisis last spring, it wasn't until September, near 5 months into the COVID pandemic, before government even announced their first large COVID program for supporting small business. It was about a $345 million program. It actually, interestingly enough, formed part of the NDP's election platform. And so the COVID Restart funding program was announced just 4 days ahead of then Premier John Horgan dropping the writ and announcing that we were going to go into an unnecessary and risky pandemic election. When we went into the election, government basically was put on hold, although there was lots of mention about how the programs would continue to roll out the door. Nothing could be further from the truth. We did not see any applications received or actually acted on by government for about 2.5 months. So although they waited 5 months for announcing the initial program, it was not until December until any of the funding associated with that particular grant program was actually getting out the door. And here we are near 15 months into the pandemic. And as of last week, it's my understanding, only about 50%, so only half of the $345 million is actually rolled out the door. And we certainly appreciate that there needs to be rigor around the application process. We want to make sure that the money is used appropriately. But the funding initiatives are of no benefit to anybody, certainly no benefit to businesses or to communities, until those dollars actually go out the door of government and actually reach and get into the hands of struggling small businesses. So there are certainly some challenges with respect to the timing of the actual announcement of that particular program. And here now, 15 months into the pandemic, still have some real challenges with how long it is taking government to actually provide those necessary supports for business. So this slide deck, my apologies, is about 3 weeks old, and there was an announcement just last week, actually, of an expansion of the COVID Restart program. They provided an additional $50 million that will be directed to assist with major attractions in the province. that is a new program, and so we're certainly very appreciative that government has actually stepped forward to meet that need. Now, with that, there are some challenges, and if we have a look at some of the local events, whether it's the Salmon Arm Fall Fair, the Interior Provincial Exhibition, and Armstrong Spell Machine, or even the Falkland Rodeo, these attractions actually do not currently meet the eligibility criteria. So although government has come out with this new $50 million program to help major attractions, the current criteria does not allow or permit these small local attractions the ability to make application. I had the opportunity of raising some questions in the legislature last week. It was fairly widely reported on, and we're doing what we can as the official opposition to encourage government to reconsider some of those very strict application criterion, so that some of the local events that we all enjoy and rely on and provide significant economic benefit to our region, that they have the ability and opportunity to make application to those funds. In addition to that, obviously, we've got challenges with health authorities with the current budget, a $1.1 billion in funding cut. Now, as I mentioned at the outset, the province runs on about a $70 billion annual budget. Health care is the single largest expenditure of government. It represents about 42 to 43 cents out of every dollar of expenditure of government. But at a time when we're dealing with a significant backlog in surgeries, as we look to getting through the pandemic, now is the time to actually increase spending within our healthcare system, not to lighten it up. And so we were very concerned to see a little over $1 billion cut from the provincial budget in healthcare funding. School districts also across the province are having a significant challenge with meeting some of the increased costs that were associated with COVID, lower enrollment numbers, more parents deciding to keep their children at home, actually reduced funding to many different school districts. And so not just here in School District 83 in the local Shuswap, but around the province, school districts are having some pretty challenging times in presenting their budget for this current year. Some school districts are going so far as to look at cutting music and sports programs, and that obviously has created a lot of angst. And so again, part of our work as the official opposition is to encourage government to step up and to meet some of those increasing needs, of school districts, health authorities, and businesses, around the province. As well, we've got $3.25 billion in contingency. So on a $70 billion government, or $70 billion year budget, governments typically will set aside a significant amount of money for contingencies. At the outset of the year, they're never able to fully appreciate and realize all of the different challenges that may be upon them. But what has happened in this year's budget, there's a very significant, this is the largest contingency that I'm aware of that any government in British Columbia has ever put forward. So $3.25 billion surplus. They've identified it as a COVID contingency fund, and certainly appreciate that government needs to be cognizant in setting dollars aside for the uncertainties that may lie ahead. But I think what's important to note is that the size of the contingency budget does provide government with the funding envelope to meet many of the needs. $3.25 billion, that's $3,250 million. So when you see something as small as a $53 million funding cut for school districts, when they're sitting on $3,250 million, you kind of have to wonder, why would government not have just used a small portion of that contingency just to make school districts whole across the province? Sorry, I think I've jumped out of queue here. Great, so healthcare. So this ties back to my critic portfolio as the critic for labor. There's been two bills that have been tabled in the legislature in the last month. One is Bill 3, Bill 3 is for paid leave for workers in order to obtain vaccinations. And Bill 13 was the bill that just received royal assent last week. And that is with respect to the provision of paid sick leave for workers. I'll start with Bill 3. So as we know, many businesses are encouraging workers, like we're encouraging everyone that we can, to get vaccinated as quickly as they can. There was some concern expressed by workers around the province about the inability of always being able to schedule their vaccine appointments outside of work hours. And so Bill 3 provides paid leave. It was actually written into the Employment Standards Act, which is a requirement. So businesses are now obligated to actually provide up to 3 hours of paid leave for workers to obtain their vaccinations. When I had an opportunity to question the Labor Minister in the legislature around the work that was undertaken to provide and to present the actual legislation, there was a couple concerns, and one was that why so long? Workers that were taking time away from work to become vaccinated over the last 4 months are excluded from the legislation because the legislation was not retroactive. So the initial questions were around, why did government wait so long? If there was a need and this was something that workers were looking for, what would have stopped government from bringing forward that legislation last summer, last fall, or back in December when the House sat, or even as early as March 1st of this year? And didn't really get any concise answers with respect to that. There's also some challenges within the actual legislation itself, and that the legislation, which has now become an act and is actually law and part of the Employment Standards Act, does not provide the sufficient clarity with respect to what is the requirement of employers to actually provide the paid leave. Two pieces. One is that it indicates that for an employee to obtain paid leave to get their vaccination shot, they have to schedule an appointment and the employer has the opportunity to look for that. Where there's a disconnect is that there isn't a requirement from what we can see in the legislation that a worker has to actually become vaccinated. So one of the questions I pose is that if a worker has scheduled their vaccination appointment, they get leave from their employer to go get vaccinated. If they happen to show up at the pharmacy and the pharmacy is out of vaccinations and they can't actually get their shot, are they still entitled to that paid leave or not? And the minister was unwilling to actually provide that clarification in the answer. Where I think it matters is that as we see, the requirement for upwards of 2 doses or 2 shots, there's also been discussions by many of the medical vaccine companies around the world about the potential need for a 3rd or booster shot. So the 3 hours of paid leave in itself may not sound increasingly onerous on a business, but if it's not just 1 dose, it's 2 doses and potentially a 3rd booster, and if there's the potential for even a missed vaccine appointment, there could be significant impacts on businesses. When the minister consulted with the broader business community, they had indicated that the legislation would only be in place while the COVID emergency was amongst us. And so most business communities and organizations that I had spoken to as the critic, it indicated that it was their understanding that once the COVID health orders or the Emergency Health Act is actually lifted, which we anticipate will be later this fall, that this piece of legislation would disappear. But the language was changed. And so although there's always the opportunity for repealing the legislation, the provision for repealing is now set, and the definition that government has used in the legislation is that the legislation would stay in place as long as COVID remains a threat. And I think we can all appreciate that COVID will likely be around for the next 10 or 20 or 50 years going forward. And so although the consultation had indicated that this particular paid leave provision was only going to be in place while the health emergency was in place, we're now believing that it's going to be in place for many years into the future. Bill 13, which provides the provision for paid leave, that one is even more onerous on businesses. The estimated annual cost that may be borne by businesses on account of paid leave is in the magnitude of $2 to $3 billion a year annually. And without getting to a lot of the specifics, there's kind of two main parts to the paid leave provision. The first is a temporary paid leave provision, which is a maximum of 3 days between now and December 31st. And the second piece has to do with a permanent paid sick leave provision that would actually come into force and effect on January 1st of next year. There's been lots of communication out around the province where government is looking to provide reimbursement for businesses for those 3 days, up to a maximum of $200 per day for those 3 days of paid leave for workers to take advantage of it between now and December 31st. The challenge is that for many businesses that have incremental increased cost associated with this legislation, they're actually going to be cut out and ineligible for actually making application for reimbursement. And I'll just give one example. Clothing retailer in downtown Vancouver have had their sales plummet by over 45% on account of COVID. They have 2 full-time employees that are eligible for paid leave. Their 7 part-time employees are currently not covered for paid leave under their current plan. The new legislation provides the provision for paid leave both for full and part-time workers. So for this particular business organization, 7 of their part-time employees will now be eligible for these 3 days of paid leave. So 3 times 7 is 21. If their average wage is $200, that could be an additional $4,200 in tax burden. Unfortunately, the way the minister and the premier have announced this program, they've indicated that businesses that already have a paid leave program are ineligible to make application for reimbursement. So although this business will be, in particular, be significantly impacted by this new legislation, government's eligibility criteria is basically excluding any businesses that already have any form of a paid leave provision. Canvassed many questions in the legislature about that issue. And we're hoping that as government look to develop and put all the finer details on this reimbursement program, that they look to extend coverage to businesses that have any incremental increased cost associated with this particular piece of legislation. The other piece that was concerning is that the legislation itself identifies the eligibility of paid leave both for full-time and part-time workers. However, and I asked the question to the minister, a part-time worker who's eligible for 3 days may work for 2 or 3 different employees or employers. And in that instance, and I asked the question of the minister, so a part-time employee that works for 3 different employers, are they eligible for up to 3 days of paid leave for each of those 3 employers? And the minister responded that yes, they were. And so this piece of legislation actually creates some inequity where a worker that's employed full-time for one employer is entitled to 3 days of paid leave under this new legislation, whereas a part-time worker that works for 3 different employers could be eligible for up to 9 days. And so I think there's just some challenges. It appears that this legislation was thrown together in, quite hastily and is creating a bit of an inequity. So with Bill 13, I mentioned the paid leave provision, which is through till December 31st, with the potential opportunity for some businesses to apply for reimbursement. What government has done, though, is they've also enabled themselves on January 1st to put in a permanent paid leave program without the requirement of having any debate in the legislature. So, this particular piece is really troubling and concerning both to the BC Liberal opposition and also the Green Party, because what it does is it allows government, basically the premier and his cabinet, will be able to make their own determination on what a permanent paid leave program will be on January 1st without the scrutiny of the legislature. And so that is a real diversion from the way typically governments would act, especially a permanent paid sick leave program, which could potentially put between $2 and $4 billion of additional tax burden or cost on the backs of already struggling BC businesses. Back to just the healthcare piece. Obviously, there was many commitments and promises made during the last provincial election, and yet the budget does not reflect some of those large commitments. And so just something that I think we should all be aware of, just because there's an announcement and some dialogue around it, until it actually shows itself and is represented in the provincial budget, there's not a lot of certainty that some of these projects are going to actually move forward. Childcare, I saw an announcement just this week. There's 22 new childcare spaces coming to Salmon Arm, which is fantastic, because we know we've got the increasing need for childcare around the province. It is good to see that the government has actually turned their mind to it. However, they are far short of some of the commitments that were made both in the 2017 and the 2020 election. Around mental health and addictions, certainly goes without saying the significant impact that that COVID has had, both respect to COVID and the virus itself, but moreover the significant number of opioid deaths last year, a significant number of BC residents, and these are people's their brothers and sisters and aunts and uncles. And parents that actually perished from the opioid crisis. And there is a real need for government to step things up and to provide that opportunity for folks to get on a path to recovery. So, it's just something to be aware of. It. I don't think there's many of us that haven't been impacted some way, shape, or form by increasing challenges with drug and alcohol addiction in our province. Housing affordability. Interesting, we go back to the 2017 election. Housing affordability was one of the biggest planks of the NDP election promise. There were concerns, certainly, which was probably more over in the Lower Mainland than here in the Shuswap, but the out of control housing prices. Things have only got worse under the current government. And despite many predictions federally around what might happen to housing prices on account of COVID, we've seen significant increases, over 20% increase in housing prices. Housing has never been more unaffordable and more out of reach for many small first-time home buyers. It really comes down to a supply issue. We have not been building houses near quickly enough to provide those housing options. It's economics 101. If the demand is increasing and supply is diminishing or not keeping up with demand, prices are going to continue to escalate out of control. Was on a call this morning with Mayor Harrison and Salmon Arm Council, and this is one of the issues that that was raised, and one of the challenges that I think many communities are suffering and struggling with around the province. And again, the budget, some of the previous commitments of the NDP in their election platform around renters rebates, their work to try and assist homeowners with keeping strat insurance rates low. We still really haven't seen any work on that front. And on the $114,000 new units of affordable housing, they're only have achieved 3% of that. Now, if we look around Salmon Arm, we've been very fortunate. Salmon Arm has been very proactive in making application and providing assistance through the Canadian Mental Health Association and others to advance some of the housing starts here in the Salmon Arm community. But I think it's worthwhile mentioning that their 10-year commitment of 114,000 units here 4 years into their second mandate now, they've only met 3% of their original commitment. Deficits, province of BC received a credit downgrade earlier this week. Credit ratings are important because they're directly tied to the actual interest that government pays on its longer term debt. When our credit rating falls, so does the cost of interest that we pay on our debt goes up. And so that means that more money is going towards covering interest costs rather than going back into programs and services which are of benefit to British Columbians. It was only back in 2017 when BC recorded its largest ever budget surplus. That was at $2.7 billion. And although there's a significant challenge around the economy with respect to COVID, we're increasingly concerned that as we see the economy return to pre-COVID numbers, which we anticipate will happen by next year, government seems to continue to want to go into deficit for the next 7 years. And if we have a look at the significant deficit, the magnitude of that, and how hard it will be in future years just to return to a balanced budget, let alone looking at the opportunity for paying down debt, certainly something that I think business owners should be very concerned about. It was kind of in broad strokes what's happened to the provincial debt, both from 2020 right through to 2023. Again, pretty significant debt, about an additional $10,000 in debt per person. So if you're a family of four, that's $40,000 of additional new debt for that family of four in the province. And somebody at some point in time will have to pay that back. And we're certainly, I think, fortunate to have very low interest rates right now. But for any of you on the phone that might, or on the call today that might be over the age of 40, I can remember, I think my first vehicle loan back in the mid 80s was around 12%. And I recall back in the, also, I guess it was in the early 80s, interest rates, even on mortgages, upwards of 20%. And, you know, I think for many of us that are in business and looking at debt service charges, you know, even an increase of 4 or 5% in interest rates could be very challenging for businesses to actually handle. So no different than our province. We want to make sure that we're not living beyond our means. Again, this is just kind of looking at the deficits that's actually were incurred last year, forecast for this year and for next year. Yeah, so this is just kind of showing the COVID cases. It's great to see that we're now on the downward trend. We're getting to some of the lowest COVID case counts that we've seen in a number of months. It certainly appears that we're on the path to recovery as we see increasing numbers of British Columbians obtaining their vaccination shot. As we see the sun returning, more people spending more time outside. I think that you know, most folks that I'm talking to are certainly optimistic. And although I believe COVID will be around for many, many years to come, I think it is definitely getting into more of a manageable place. And the federal government is going to be under increasing pressure, I think, to look at opening up our international borders. And so there's, I think, hopefully lots more optimism in the Shuswap this year than there was last year around this time. So some of the things that you know, we certainly feel are missing, and although it's not on this slide deck, the one piece that causes me probably the greatest amount of concern, and this I guess will relate to one of the roles I had from 2013 to 17. I was a parliamentary secretary with responsibility for BC's jobs plan. And one of the most important areas we know for capital attraction and for economic growth is making sure that the tax competitiveness of our province is in line with other jurisdictions. And I've spoken to this particular topic, I know, many times in the past with this particular chamber and chambers across the province, is the fact that what has happened in the last 4 years is the competitiveness of BC businesses has continued to erode. For a business that might be operating within British Columbia and just competing with other businesses within the province, it does not have as big an impact. But when we have a manufacturing sector, when we have economies around the globe competing more on a global basis, especially for the manufacturing sector, it is really important that BC gives strong consideration to where our tax policies sit with relation to the competitiveness. So I'll give you a couple examples. Our neighboring jurisdiction of Alberta, corporate tax rate in Alberta is 8%. In BC, it is now 12%. So a full 50% higher than the tax rate corporately in our neighboring jurisdiction of Alberta. And the corporate tax rate in some of the other provinces or states that we compete with south of the border, many states in the United States, especially the northern regions, Washington State, Oregon, Arizona, Utah, they actually have no corporate tax rate. And so, you know, our tax rate is certainly one of the areas that that causes concern for businesses as far as their ability to compete in other marketplaces. We also have had a significant increase in the minimum wage rate over the last number of years, and the much concerning employer health tax. And the employer health tax, which is for most businesses with over $500,000 in payroll, an additional 1.95%. That is a tax that does not exist in our neighboring jurisdiction of Alberta or south of the border, as an example. And so, you know, it's important to, as government look at moving forward, to have a look at that broader tax policy and what is government doing to ensure that businesses that are operating, you know, in British Columbia, or more specifically here in the Shuswap, that they have the opportunity to compete on a global stage. And, you know, we've got a pretty healthy manufacturing sector up in the Salmon Arm Industrial Park, you know, as an example. But again, a lot of the manufacturing that happens there is destined for markets outside of British Columbia. And if we see this continual accumulation of additional cost burden, whether it's increases in corporate tax, pressure from increases in minimum wage, the employer health tax, now the potential additional costs being put and borne by businesses on account of paid sick leave and other programs like that, it's the death by 1,000 cuts. And I know that many business sectors are increasingly concerned and starting to raise the alarm bells that if we want to be able to attract capital investment to our province, where, you know, and capital is mobile, we need to make sure that we're not just continuing to put additional cost burden on businesses year after year. At some point in time, businesses will throw up their hands and decide to move to other jurisdictions, and that would not be good for anybody, either here in the Shuswap or across the province. So you've probably heard enough of me speaking away, so certainly happy to take any questions and just kind of have an open conversation with all of you.
Thank you so much, Greg. Sorry about that. I lost my screen. I've got too many of them. So for the question and answer period, I'm just going to put this up here. Feel free to raise your hand and we'll take them in order. I do have a first question in the chat as well, and feel free to put your questions in the chat. So our first question, Greg says, could you comment on the Salmon Arm West project? Although we celebrate girders finally being placed, curious as to how much the cost of this project may have increased.
Yeah, thank you very much for raising that. You know, I was very proud to announce the Salmon Arm West project in September of 2016 with then Transportation Minister Todd Stone, the MLA for Kamloops-Thompson. You know, Salmon Arm has been advocating for that particular upgrading and replacement of the Salmon Arm River Bridge for as long as I can remember, probably for well over 25 years. So really happy to see that project being announced. It was fully funded. The majority of property acquisitions had already been undertaken at that point in time. The project was announced at full 6.1 kilometers. So there's three kind of segments. The first segment was the area that's being worked on now, which is basically the replacement of the Salmon River Bridge. The second segment would be the section back towards Salmon Arm. And then the third phase, or the third segment of the project, was out towards First Nations Road and providing improved access for the Nisqually Indian Band. So 6.1 kilometers, $162.7 million was the budgeted amount. And I think it's important to note, when government announces a budget for a project, there's nothing worse than providing a budget figure that is too low and then to be embarrassed by cost overruns. there were significant contingencies built into that $162.7 million budget. What has happened, unfortunately, is that one, the project was stalled out for a number of years, and I never was able to get any real firm answers from government on why that was. So as we know, construction costs go up year over year incrementally, and so that stalling and delaying of getting that project actually underway added significant costs. But the other piece that I think is of note is government has chosen to put forward what they call their CBA. It's a community benefit agreement. It's just another fancy name for a union-only hiring program. 85% of construction workers in the province are not unionized currently, but John Horgan and the NDP have chosen to put a requirement for any Highway 1 expansion projects over $50 million in size. They are actually required to go through a CBA process, which requires any construction worker working on that project to actually form and join one of the NDP's 19 selected unions. So it's a very discriminatory policy, but what has happened is many of the private sector companies have chosen not to bid. And on this particular project in Salmon Arm, what has happened, that $162.7 million project, which was providing 6.1 kilometers, the project is now increased in cost by a full $20 million. So that's about the cost that we could otherwise buy or build a small elementary school for. So that's the cost overrun, but they've cut the project literally in half. For $20 million more, they've now totally eliminated the third segment of that project. And now we're only getting 3.3 kilometers for $20 million more. So, you know, it's extremely disrespectful to folks that choose, you know, not to be part of a union. And I certainly appreciate choice. As much as people should have the right to choose to associate, they should also have the right to choose not to associate. John Horgan has made the decision that workers no longer have the right not to associate, not if you want to work on a government-funded project. And so, although the name community benefit sounds wonderful, how could anybody oppose to a community benefit project? Well, I'll tell you what, if you're a private sector contractor in the local community and local area, you were largely cut out from participating in these projects because there's been fewer bidders. It has escalated the cost significantly. And it's a great disrespect to local residents and to taxpayers. You know, again, that 6.1 kilometer project is now only 3.3 kilometers long, and it's costing $20 million more than initially budgeted. So thanks for raising that. It's something that certainly causes me a great amount of concern. And if you have a look at the 2.8 kilometers that were cut from that project, there has actually been no new incremental increase in four laning on the on Trans-Canada Highway in the Shuswap in the last 4 years. So in 2017, government, the NDP indicated they were going to expedite and accelerate four laning projects here in the Shuswap. In 4 years, all we've seen is the addition of about 2.1 kilometers of four laning announced in Sicamous. That project is yet to even get started underway, and that's for the Broome Bridge. But the addition of the 2.1 kilometers in Sicamous is actually less than the amount of four laning that they've canceled from the Salmon Arm project. So in 4 years, we're actually having a net reduction in the amount of four laning here in the Shuswap as compared to what was already funded and announced prior to the 2017 election.
Thanks, Greg. And a follow-up to that is, why are we being exempted from four laning?
Well, you know, it's government's choice. Rather than government keeping things open to all construction workers in the province, they've taken a very narrow mind and have chosen to put the needs of 15% of construction workers and those 19 select unions in BC and advance them ahead of the rights of the 85% of workers that choose not to associate. And I can just maybe remind those that are on the call today that in many instances, private sector contractors pay wage rates that are actually higher than unionized workforces. So, I think there's maybe a concept, and many people have the belief that, oh, well, union organizations are fantastic. It actually results in increased wages. Not always the case, and especially not with the construction sector in the province. So, why government is choosing to stall out projects here in the Shuswap and focus on their energies, largely in the lower mainland, or where the bulk of the population is, that'd be a question for government. But I could speculate, but I probably won't do that here today.
Thanks, Greg. Susan, does that answer your question? Yes. All right. Any other questions?
If we have time, Carolyn, and certainly I'd really welcome the opportunity to hear from any of your members if they have anything to share with respect to, how are they feeling, or what has been the impact of COVID on their bottom line, how much of their savings have been eroded over the last year, and what's their sense of optimism for the current season and going forward?
That's a great question. Would anyone like to share? I know everyone's camera's off, but feel free to turn your camera on, your microphone on, and take this opportunity to share the impacts of COVID. I know I can't speak too much as I only started at the chamber in January, so just getting used to things here. There's Michelle. Perfect.
Sure. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Awesome.
Absolutely.
Hi, everybody. I'm Michelle Kuster. I'm the Convention and Sales Manager here at the Prestige in Salmon. Nice to see everybody. I know for us, I've just come into this position as well as haven't been with the Chamber too long, but I know even just coming here in March into this position, obviously COVID is greatly affecting and impacting things in the tourism industry here. I know specifically for us, everybody is just anticipating and waiting for things to open up a little bit and understanding what that looks like. I think it's just going to be interesting, I guess, for us to see how we navigate this moving forward. And I know it's tough because even for us, we're losing every time they make an announcement. We lose a bit of business because people will opt for an outdoor setting if they can have more people, things like this. So we're always trying to basically, not fight, that's a bad word to use, but essentially always trying to figure out a way to make business happen when the regulations are slammed down on us and they're being, asking us as the hospitality and tourism industry to enforce some of these regulations that the provincial health authority is kind of implementing, which puts us in a really hard position. It's an awkward position for our front staff to have to ask, what your plans are, your reasons for travel, and really it's creating this kind of animosity and judgmental, feelings, I think, with some of our neighboring provinces, which is really not going to help our tourism sector at all when things do open up. There's a lot of animosity there, so I think there's a big need for reparation of harm in some of those areas as well. So that was all I was going to say.
Oh, thank you very much for that, Michelle. And it's interesting, one other consideration, I'm speaking to a government MLA, an NEP MLA a few weeks back, and talked about, some of the significant challenges that businesses are facing on account of this, recent circuit breaker. And I think we can all appreciate that we all need to do everything we can to try and reduce COVID transmission. But what was interesting was, I guess, the lack of understanding of the impacts. And so the conversation or the comments that were shared with me is that, well, sure, fair enough, businesses are going to reduce their revenue, but they can just lay off their staff, and they can do other cost-cutting measures to get through this until things open up. And I shared with the member, I said, well, one of the challenges, I said, I don't know if you obviously have never owned a business before, and admitted that they hadn't. And I said, well, in the Shuswap, if you don't have your full complement of staff in place by the middle of April, you're probably not going to find those staff and you're not going to operate. And, for businesses faced with the circuit breaker, if they just simply laid off all of their staff and sent them all home, many of those folks would either move away or find alternative work, and they wouldn't necessarily be there for when things open up again, which is now we anticipate will be maybe as early as June 15th. And so it's not as easy as just lay those folks off, because for many businesses, they've had to keep those staff on and incur those wage costs and try and find other make work projects, just because they know that if they wait until the 15th of June to try and return their workers, many of them are not going to be there. And if you don't have your staff in place early, you won't actually be able to operate. I know just with our own businesses in Sycamoose, trying to find cleaners or porters or laborers last summer was almost an impossibility. And, I think part of that is attributable to the very lucrative CERB program. We had young workers showing up last year saying, look, I'm making the equivalent of $18 an hour, $2,000 net take home a month, doing nothing. You want me to come to work for you and you want me to start at $18 an hour? My take home is going to be actually less than it is sitting on CERB. And so, government, the federal government, and this is a criticism, not to be criticizing, the Liberals necessarily, but it has caused a significant challenge across the country. And it's not just here in BC, but you try and encourage somebody to come to work when they can sit at home making $2,000 a month. That's a pretty hard argument. And so there's a huge amount of people that aren't actually actively employed, but if they're not looking for work, they're not even recorded in the unemployment statistics. A bit of a fun fact, or maybe a concerning fact, but when the province announces the unemployment rate in the province, it is based on a monthly survey of 50,000 homes. So it's a phone survey. And if they were to call you and ask you, are you working? No. Okay. Are you actively looking for work? Well, if you're not actively looking for work because you're happy to be taking your $2,000 a month CERB payment, you're not actually recorded as being unemployed. So when we have a look at the reported unemployment level in the province, that is a very, very low bar. And the actual number of folks that are actually not working that otherwise could or should be is a very, very different number. And so it's, I think it's important to note that sometimes the federal supports, which are valuable and necessary, also have unintended consequences. And I'm not sure if any of the other members on the call today want to comment on that, but I'm hearing from businesses around the Shuswap that is increasingly tough to get folks to come to work, and their wage expectation level is also very, very high.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because that is something that's come up a lot, where people are looking for servers or they're looking for cleaners, and they just can't get people to fill those roles because of CERB. Is there any timeline on that from the federal government, and when they'll stop just willy-nilly allowing everyone to collect it without actually going through the full process?
What I've heard, and the federal government certainly hasn't announced this, but I think it'll continue until such time as there's the next federal election. I believe they've extended it through until September, I think is the number that I heard, but don't quote me on that. I haven't followed it all that closely. But as we look to the fall for a potential federal election, I don't see that program, that benefit program, being lifted ahead of the next federal election. Not that politics should have anything to do with funding programs, but
yep. And before we close here, because I know everyone wants to get back to work, Chris, did you have any questions as well?
Yeah, hi everybody. I'm Chris Lind from Apple Auto Glass in Salmon Arm. We've, as our shop, been fortunate to power through the pandemic and still be fairly busy. We're not back to full force yet, but we've taken it very seriously. So we have very strict measures as far as keeping ourselves and our customers safe. But that set aside, I want to talk about tourism and the potential that we've got, because obviously that's one of the biggest, hardest hit industries in our area. And, you know, given the restrictions on travel, everyone's staying home and trying to enjoy what we have. I know from a recent Destination BC study, tourism is as big of an industry as mining and forestry combined, almost exactly. So it kind of doubles each of them a little bit. Obviously, a big chunk of that would have been foreign tourism, but that's obviously going through a big shift to, I imagine there was a large portion of it domestic before, but now it's even more than ever. So that's what we're going to be relying on locally, is domestic tourism. Our provincial parks are overwhelmed. That's nothing new, but they are more than ever for that same reason. But there is a huge resource of crown land that's not being properly managed, which can be potentially tapped into. So rec sites and trails has been spread thin for quite some time. So for ways of possibly increasing recreation in the backcountry, like for camping or just trails of all kinds, whether it be ORV, horseback, on foot, cycling. There's a huge asset there that isn't even identified, and increase in support for that division of the government would help identify those assets and hopefully be able to direct funds there to improve it and to protect it at the same time. So just I would say that might be a worthwhile direction to be sending some of our public funds into that department of the province.
Yeah, absolutely, Chris, and thanks for that. You know, you're absolutely bang on. I know you just have to have a look on Kijiji or the local social media channels to see to see just how quickly RVs are selling. I think for the first time in history, we've actually seen an appreciation in the price of boats and recreational products, and there's more and more people taking to the backcountry. And you're right. We are blessed with an amazing topography, and it's the most beautiful province in all of Canada. And it would be a great initiative for government to look at the opportunities of trying to provide, I guess, increased campsites and recreational trails around the province. We're so fortunate here to have the Shuswap Trail Alliance. They've been doing an amazing job over the last 15 years now, I guess. But you know, having some additional support from the province to support those sectors would definitely be valuable.
Thanks.
Thanks, Chris.
Thanks, Chris. MLA Greg Kyllo, will we be able to steal a couple more minutes of your time?
Absolutely.
Okay, perfect. Darren had a question. Darren, do you want to ask via microphone, or do you want me to read it out?
Sure, I can talk. I think I can talk.
Hi, Darren.
Hi, Greg. I just wondered if anything through the government is coming down the pipe, like when we're talking about alcohol and drug, a lot of opioid crisis stuff gets mentioned, and there's all this focus on opioid crisis. I don't want to minimize the trouble that's caused. Certainly the numbers are astronomical, but there doesn't seem to be any focus on alcoholism per se. And we know that alcoholism is causing more deaths than all other drugs combined, but it just keeps focusing on the opioid crisis. Just wondering if you can comment on that, I guess.
Yeah, no, a very valid point, and I'm not the critic for that particular portfolio, so I don't have a lot of ready information, but I'm certainly happy to reach out to our critic and to provide some additional information for you. As you know, and government is very broad and it's hard to be an expert on all things government.
Sure.
But, you know, I think if there has been a heightened awareness and focus, obviously, on the opioid crisis and the number of fatalities associated. And I don't think that in any way that is intended to take the focus away from the concerns around alcohol. But tell you what, I'm happy to connect you with our critic for mental health and addictions, and just to see what initiatives government are taking around the alcohol piece. I'm not really that familiar with it.
Okay.
So sorry, I can't comment more.
Fair enough. Because I was just going to say that alcoholism related problems, there's about 10 times the amount of hospitalizations related to alcoholism than there are other drugs. So there is definitely a crisis in terms of opiates, people overdosing, but there's also the look at what it does to the system in the hospitals for having people in extended long stays because of alcoholism and its associated problems with health. So.
Yeah, no, thanks for raising that. And Darren, if it's okay, I'll maybe connect with you afterwards, and sure, we can have a further discussion about it. And I'll reach out to our critic and see if we can maybe turn our minds together and see if there's maybe an opportunity, even through the estimates process, of raising some more specific questions around that directly to the minister that has responsibility.
Perfect. Sure. Thanks.
Thanks, Darren. I appreciate that question as well, because when we think about the impacts of COVID, we think about more people working from home, and, you know, happy hour starts at 10 a.m. And, you know, I'm seeing that personally with a lot of people that I know as well. So it's a super, super valid question as well. So appreciate that, Darren, and you being our kind of in-house knowledge on that as well.
Well, I could tell you with our treatment center, Foothill Center for Change, we're loaded right now with alcohol and cocaine abusers and no opiates whatsoever. And it's been actually quite a pattern through the COVID.
Darren, you're able to share what the percentages are? Is it, you know, 80-20 alcohol to cocaine?
Yeah, I don't know that offhand.
70% alcoholics to 30%.
Paris is in the background telling me that it's probably, we see about 70% alcoholism and cocaine, 30% kind of thing.
Okay, all right. Great. Well, hey, we'll certainly, it'd be long overdue for a visit and a catch up anyhow, so.
Cool. Yeah.
Greg.
Perfect. Thank you. So if anyone else has any other questions for Greg, we've got his email on there, greg.kyllo.mla@leg.bc.ca. Feel free to message any questions to him. I've also got my information there if you have any questions. And any closing thoughts?
Well, just wanted to thank you very much, Carolyn, for your efforts to organize this today and for pulling everybody together. It's always a great opportunity to talk to the hardworking men and women of Shuswap, and especially those in business. Without the private sector, government would not have the revenues by which it provides all those other necessary supports and services that we all rely on. So thank everybody for what you guys are doing to keep BC working and employed.
Perfect. Thank you. Have a great day, everyone. And it is now sunny now, but we got a big storm during your talk. I'm not sure if you heard, but our building shook.